that when you bring people from place A to place B, B becomes more like A. If you ask why is a place like that, it's because of the people there. Culture is just the plural of personality. You say, why is Mexico like that? Mexicans. Why is Syria like that? Syrians. Why is India like that? Indians. And so we didn't have a system of deciding who can and cannot be an American, or we will lose American culture. You cannot have semi-enforced law, and you cannot remove the law, which means you must implement the law. You must enforce the law. You must close the border. You must deport all 40 million illegal immigrants, and you must arrest those who are trying to stop you. America is for Americans. America first. The American government exists to protect American law and American culture. And that's why we need to deport all 40 million illegal immigrants. Hello, I'm Jake Huffaker, and you're watching episode 5 of Morally Right. In this episode, we're going to talk about 3 things. First, we're going to explain how the current status quo, this semi-enforced law of, we'll allow some illegal border crossings and we'll deport some illegal immigrants, this semi-enforced law cannot stand. Second, we're going to talk about how an unenforced law, which would be the left-wing solution to a semi-enforced law, things like sanctuary cities, things like open borders, and all of these protests against ICE agents, this unenforced law would be even worse than semi-enforced law. And third, we're going to talk about the implementation of the law. What America needs to do if it wants to regain control over its own systems. And so first, talking about semi-enforced law. We're going to talk about how we need to be a nation of laws. We're going to talk about an outlaw class of illegal immigrants, which is creating a lawlessness society. And then we're going to talk about what that lawlessness is doing, about the gangs and the murder rates. So we talk about how to be a nation of laws. How does our Constitution work? Well, we have 3 branches. And the 2 important ones in this case are the executive and the legislative. The legislative branch writes the law, and the executive branch enforces the law. And to be a nation, you need to have borders. You need to control who is and is not a member of that nation, who is and is not subject to that nation's laws, who is allowed to be within that nation. That's how countries have worked. That's what they need to be in order to be a stable country. So we have our laws passed by Congress. It's the job of the executive branch to then execute on that law. And if someone violates that law by sneaking across the border, by coming in illegally, undocumented, without their papers, you need to execute the law. We're a country of laws, and we need to follow those laws. We cannot abdicate our role as Congress. We cannot cede the power of writing the law to the executive branch or to an unelected group of protesters. The Constitution requires that we follow the law, that Congress writes the law, and the president executes it. And it is currently not legal to cross the border illegally. We need to deport those people. And pragmatically, we need to deport those people because they're an outlaw class. Those people exist outside of the law. And the reason why this is the case is because they cannot rely on the police. If a crime happens to an illegal immigrant, or even a crime happens to a group of people that happens to have an illegal immigrant in it, there's the fear that if you call the police, you might get deported. I lived in Lubbock, Texas for a while, and I knew some illegal immigrants there, and they were all terrified they might get deported. When crimes happened to them, they never got reported. They're not in any crime statistics database. They're not in any numbers. But anecdotally, this is a point the left used to talk about all the time. The left used to say, this is why we need sanctuary cities, because these people cannot utilize the law. They're not safe. They exist outside of the law, and therefore they're an outlaw class. This semi-enforced nature of the law where the police might deport them and might not. You might be in a sanctuary city, you might get across the border legally, you might get a cop who's sympathetic, or you might not. And so they can't rely on the police. So they exist outside of the law and are therefore an outlaw class. You need to either remove the outlaw or remove the law that made them an outlaw. But you cannot have this system of 40 million outlaws in a country. That's not a stable approach. And one of the main reasons why it's not a stable approach is because it generates lawlessness in gangs. When you look at the murder rates along the borders of Mexico and along the states of Mexico, you notice that 3 of the top 10 states by murder rate are the ones right along the Mexican border, not with the Rio Grande. They are Baja California, Chihuahua, and Sonora. The first two are fairly consistently in the top 3 states for murder rates. And it's because we have an incentive structure of semi-enforced law, where we allow people, if you make it across, well, now you probably get to stay. But you have to manage that system of evading the law to now exist within the United States. And that incentive structure of semi-enforced law creates coyotes. It creates human trafficking. It creates gangs. It creates cartels. And these cartels decimate and dominate the Mexican border in Mexico. If you care about the murdered children, the decimated communities along the Mexican border, in Baja California, in Chihuahua, in Sonora, well, then you have to cut off their incentive structure. You have to enforce the law. You have to say there's no market for coyotes anymore. There's no market for crossing the border illegally anymore. There's no market for cartels. There's no market for this. You have to have strict enforcement of the law, strict border checks. We cannot allow this stuff to come across the border. We have to have strict deportations, where you have the current system incentivizes people to smuggle children across the border. Under the Biden administration, we had hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors brought across. Because if you claim you have a child, well, now we're more sympathetic to you. Whether it's your child or not, we don't have the system for checking for that. And so you have incentivized this semi-enforced law, where if you had a fully open border, people could just come across and there wouldn't be the market for this gang and cartel information. If you cracked down hard on it, if you said, if you come across illegally, you are going to be deported. You remove the incentive for people to try to evade the law, and you remove one of the realms of profit for these cartels and everything. And you remove this outlaw class of people who cannot rely on the police when they get to America. You have to either enforce the law or not have the law. But this status quo of semi-enforced law is unacceptable. And so let's talk about why it would be equally, if not more, unacceptable to have an unenforced law. That would be open borders. And that would entail would be the mass influx of new people from across the world, because this is the best place. America, the classic joke, America's a terrible, terrible place, but it's the best one on earth. It's like, absolutely. We already have roughly a quarter of the Mexican population within the United States through our semi-enforced borders. If you completely opened the border, you were going to get a mass influx. You were going to overwhelm the United States, and you were going to decimate United States culture. Because different places have different cultures. This is one of those things that I used to be fairly liberal on this issue. I used to be sort of classical liberal, libertarian. Oh, well, people are all basically the same. There are different economic conditions and, there are different religions and cultures, but broadly speaking, people are the same. And I thought that until I lived in Puerto Rico. And when I moved to Puerto Rico in 2025, I speak Spanish, not fluently, but at a conversational level, and I'm ethnically Italian, and so when I tan up, I fit in. And I lived in a couple different communities. I lived in Catano. I lived in other parts more central to San Juan, other areas, Carolina. And I thought that I would just assimilate. I thought that I would become Puerto Rican. And this sounds so obvious to anyone who understands culture, but it wasn't clear to me until I lived there. Which is, I will never be Puerto Rican. I could not assimilate, no matter how hard I tried. And I was trying. But I wasn't one of them. I was an American. And by being there, my very presence changed every room. I had friends, I got along with people, and not all of them actively considered me an invader. But I felt a bit like an invader. I felt like I was modifying the area. That although I was trying to assimilate to them, I forced them to assimilate to me. And it became very clear that when you bring people from place A to place B, B becomes more like A. If you ask why is a place like that, it's because of the people there. Culture is just the plural of personality. You say, why is Mexico like that? Mexicans. Why is Syria like that? Syrians. Why is India like that? Indians within America. Why is California? Why is Ohio? Why is New Jersey? Why is Florida like that? Californians, Ohio, New Jersey, Floridians. The people of those places make the place like it is. Like, duh. And whenever you think about why is Mexico like that, you say, well, like what? Well, whatever you think of when you think of Mexico, like that. And I like American culture. I like that America is like this. And I like that Mexico is like that. And that those are different cultures. And when you bring a mass number of people, you change the culture of the area. If you were to open the border, you wouldn't have 40 million undocumented immigrants. You'd have hundreds of millions. From all over the world, not just from Mexico, from all over the world. And you say, oh, well, America is a nation of immigrants. You know, we're a nation of assimilation. We're a melting pot. It's like, well, yeah, but the ingredients have to actually melt. And so when America was first founded and through the early waves of immigration, we had a fundamentally Christian nation. You say, you know, what is a Russian Orthodox, Italian Catholic, and an English Anglican all have in common when they come to America? Well, they're all Christians. Their cultures were actually fairly similar. And they also came to America without a welfare state. They came to America that was largely unsettled. They came to America that was actively industrializing and that largely forced assimilation. And it melted these cultures together. The modern day America is not like that. In fact, we actively incentivize cultures not to melt together. We have enclaves where we encourage people to continue to speak their local language. We have public schools taught other languages. We have people waving their Mexican flags. Where you have entire communities built around the idea of being an Islamic community or a Hindu community or anything that identifies themselves as non-American, as something else American, as an aspect within America that is distinctly different from the rest of America. And you cannot continue to have that. You cannot let other cultures come to America and exist as a decimation of our culture. And you say, oh, this is a race thing. It's like, it's not a race thing. I don't want immigrants from England or Germany either. England is arresting people for speech online. Why is England like that? English people. Don't England my America. Don't Mexico my America. Don't India my America. And while I support small numbers of immigrants from all of these places, I greatly appreciate bringing in the best of other places. But they have to join the American community. They have to be Americans. You have to have a control over who enters our border so that we can, have numbers that are assimilatable, that are accountable, that we can afford under our current welfare system, that we can document and control and understand. You cannot have open borders. You need to have a selective system of immigration, of selecting the best of the best and bringing those here. And letting them melt into the American culture. America is a melting pot. And that's how it always was and how it always should be. But for recently, it hasn't been. And if we were to open the border, which is the left-wing solution, sanctuary states, to this unenforced, semi-enforced law. If you have unenforced law, you lose what it means to be an American. So now we talk about how it would be to implement this law. And that looks like first closing the border. You cannot continue to have this problem. You cannot continue to let more outlaws, people who exist outside the law, into our country. You cannot have more of this human trafficking. You cannot have more of this lawless gang cartel behavior. We need to be a nation of laws, passed by Congress, enforced by executive. First, you have to close the border. Second, you need to enforce the actual law. You need to deport the 40 million illegal immigrants who are here. And you need to do it with a plan. Gosh, you just need to do it with a plan. When Donald Trump goes into Minnesota, or tries 200,000 illegal immigrants, instead of in the places like Florida and Texas, I mean, he's there too, but he should prioritize people in Florida, Texas, deport the millions out of there first. Get the early wins. See those places improve. See the housing market change. See the labor market change. See the culture change. Show Americans what it would be like to fix America. And do it in the most efficient, most effective, most direct way possible. The places where you're not going to get mass protests, mass violence, mass fights against it. You have to be smart about how you implement the law. He's chief executive, and he needs to do it chiefly. He needs to execute correctly. But when you're doing it, you need to hold the law accountable. If you are going to be in Minnesota, you cannot allow for these protests. You cannot allow for this violence. Attacks on ICE are up 1,000%, and every single person who attacked an ICE agent needs to be behind bars. You need to not just enforce immigration law, but enforce all law. You're the chief executive, you need to execute correctly. We talk about all these protests. Why is it happening? Why is there violence? Well, because the unenforcement of the law has incentivized the violence. You have people like Tim Walz, people like Jacob Fry out there fulminating this aggression. And if you just crack down on the aggression, if you create the incentive, if you don't have this semi-enforced law, oh, well, we might arrest you for attacking a cop, or we might not. This semi-enforced law creates a culture of lawlessness. If you just enforce the law, if you said, no, you're not allowed to hit a cop with your car. And we're going to shoot people who do that. That's good. But first you have to say, no, you can't even block the cars. You cannot be agitating. You cannot be intervening with arrests. You cannot veto the democratically elected president, the democratically elected Congress, the laws that were written and are now being executed. You cannot veto that by mob rule. And if you try, the law will come down on you. The Alex Preddy shooting was a bad shooting. I don't think they should have shot Alex Preddy. We'll wait for the investigation to finally see everything before I have a final conclusion on that one. But it looks like it wasn't a good shoot. And it's the fault of the protesters and the fault of the government who didn't crack down on the protesters. When Alex Preddy attacked the cop car like a weekend before, he should have been arrested then. He should have been on the streets. When people are out there agitating with police, who are rioting against the police, who are destroying the implementation of the law, you need to crack down on that. Because if you have semi-enforced law where we might let you attack cops, or we might not, it incentivizes the attack of the cop, and that creates bad situations. You need to enforce the law. All of it. The immigration law, the rioting law, the theft law. Crime cannot continue to go unpunished, because that's how you get more crime. If you do not punish something, it'll happen more. If you pay people to do things, if you incentivize them to do things, if you let them do things, they'll do it. Duh. America is for Americans. The American law is for Americans. It was passed for Americans. It needs to be executed for Americans. We cannot have semi-enforced law. We cannot allow for these outlaw class. We cannot allow for an overriding of the actual border law. We cannot allow for these cartel gang lawlessness to be decimating America, to be decimating Mexico. If you have any empathy or sympathy for the children who have been smuggled across the border, then you have to cut off the tap. You have to remove the incentive. You cannot have unenforced law. You cannot have it. And you cannot remove the law, because that's how you destroy the American culture. That's how you overrun America with non-Americans and make America nothing like what it used to be. There is no magic soil where you come across and you're suddenly culturally American. No, there's an American culture, and it's upheld by Americans. And so we need to have a system of deciding who can and cannot be an American, or we will lose American culture. You cannot have semi-enforced law, and you cannot remove the law, which means you must implement the law. You must enforce the law. You must close the border. You must deport all 40 million illegal immigrants, and you must arrest those who are trying to stop you. America is for Americans. America first. I can't even imagine how that's been controversial, but we haven't had a president who believes that in 50 years. Trump's failed deportation system is unacceptable. Biden's 10 million illegal crossings was unacceptable. Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, the Reagan amnesty, going all the way back to the immigration passes that happened in the 60s. America, I'll say it one more time, America is for Americans. You cannot have semi-enforced law. You cannot have open borders. Deport all 40 million. Do what's right for Americans, because that's what's right for America. Thank you.